Let's review the ISLM small open economy model. And in this model, we have add a foreign sector, net exports depending on the exchange rate, to our standard Keynesian ISLM model. And we also, since we assume this is a small open economy, we have an equilibrium condition that the domestic interest rate has to be equal to the world foreign interest rate. And remember why this is the case. If it weren't, then we'd have arbitrage, right? So if our interest rate as a small open economy were lower, then the rest of the world, everybody in our country would invest abroad, and as they invest abroad, there wouldn't be domestic funds available, so our domestic interest rates would rise. So we have some mechanism that equalizes the interest rates, and that's these large scale, relative to our economy, very large scale capital flows that can happen. So in a large economy, these capital flows might not be large enough. The rest of the world's capital flows might not be large enough to affect our interest rates. So that's why in the large open economy we have possibly an interest rate that's different from the rest of the world's interest rate. In the small open economy, interest rate has to be the same. We're neglecting here, of course, the fact that returns abroad also depend on the risk of investing abroad, in particular the risk of exchange rate movements and the anticipated exchange rate movements. And we're just not going to ignore that for now. So our ISLM small open economy consists of these three equations. And since the interest rate is determinate, that means that we can plug our star in for the interest rates, and then we have two equations with two unknowns, the exchange rate and the level of GDP. And so that's what we graph here. We have sort of a modified LM equation where the LM, we plug in our star into the R there, and now the money supply determines the level of GDP, right? Because the exchange rate doesn't affect GDP on the LM side, so GDP is independent of the exchange rate. The exchange rate only shifts the composition of GDP, not the level of GDP. The level of GDP is determined by the money supply in this small open economy. Pretty unrealistic, but that's the implication of the model. And then our second equation is the IS curve, so that looks like a normal downward sloping IS curve. We're going to draw the graph, though, with the exchange rate instead of the interest rate on the axis. Since the interest rate is determined by the world, there's nothing interesting about it. So we'll have the exchange rate there, and a higher exchange rate involves a dollar appreciation in this case, and so we have lower levels of GDP. So that's why the IS curve slopes downwards with the exchange rate. So the equilibrium is pretty simple: an exchange rate level that makes GDP equal to the level that's determined by the world interest rate and the money supply. And that's really all that we have in the model. And this model's not very interesting for predictions. We're doing this sort of just to see the mechanics of the model for completeness. When we have an increase in government spending, the IS curve shifts out as normal. But the only thing that happens, since the world interest rate is the same, our LM curve cannot shift because the world interest rate is the same. So our GDP stays the same. So the rise in government spending simply crowds out exports. The exchange rate appreciates, and net exports are perfectly crowded out. So this is an implication of the model. That we don't even have a good story for why this would happen. It just sort of happens as the new equilibrium is a higher exchange rate, even though the only thing that's changed is the increase in government spending. So it's an implication that follows directly from the assumptions of the model. Monetary policy is a little more interesting. When we have, say, an increase in the money supply, we represent that by a shift to the right of the LM curve, and GDP goes up, and the lower, well, we can have lower interest rates, but the implication of the change is that we'll have a depreciated exchange rate. So there's a depreciation, and that's what mechanically leads to the higher level of GDP when interest rates are changing. So the model has these two very simplistic predictions about the effects of government policy and monetary policy, and they're fairly unrealistic, mostly because we're not taking into account the complexities of the foreign exchange markets in terms of risk premium, expected depreciations, changing price levels. But these are the implications right now. If you're in a small open economy, what policy is going to do is affect your exchange rate, and then that's going to affect your economy, and all the action in the economy is in the exchange rate.